In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a small park was the gathering place for many locals. It was the kind of park where children played, families gathered for picnics, and elderly residents took leisurely strolls. On one particular day, an elderly man named Mr. Jenkins sat on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, reading his book. He was a familiar figure in the neighborhood, a man who had lived through many challenges in his long life. He had a calm presence, and people often admired his wisdom and quiet strength. What most people didn't know was that Mr. Jenkins had a secret. He was a skilled karate master, having studied martial arts for decades. Mr. Jenkins had been teaching karate for years, but after retiring, he preferred to keep his past a secret. He no longer taught classes, choosing to live peacefully and enjoy the simple moments of life. His karate skills were unmatched, but he believed in using his abilities for defense, never for aggression. He valued inner peace, and his gentle spirit made him beloved in the community. On this particular day, as he read his book, a group of teenagers walked past him. They were a group of boys, about 16 or 17 years old, and they had a reputation for causing trouble in the neighborhood. They often teased and mocked others, feeling powerful in their group and in the safety of their youth. As they walked by Mr. Jenkins, one of the boys, Kyle, the leader of the group, noticed him sitting quietly on the bench. Kyle had always been the type to look for weaknesses in others, and he saw an opportunity to have some fun at Mr. Jenkins' expense. "Hey, old man," Kyle called out, his voice loud and mocking. The group of teens laughed as they turned to face Mr. Jenkins. They saw his calm demeanor, his wrinkled face, and the book in his hands, and they thought they had found an easy target. Mr. Jenkins didn't look up at first. He was used to rude comments from young people, but he had learned over the years that ignoring the negativity was often the best response. However, the taunting continued. One of the other boys, Mark, joined in. "What's the matter, old man? You can't even stand up. Afraid we'll break your cane." The group laughed again, the sound echoing in the quiet park. Mr. Jenkins remained still, focusing on his book, refusing to rise to the bait. The teens grew bolder, stepping closer to him. Kyle, trying to push the boundaries, reached out and grabbed Mr. Jenkins' book, yanking it from his hands. "Hey, we're talking to you," Kyle shouted, waving the book in the air. "What are you going to do about it?" The other teens jeered, egging Kyle on. Mr. Jenkins, despite the insults, kept his cool. He didn't rise from the bench, didn't say a word, but inside, his calm was beginning to shift. He knew how to handle this, but he also knew the importance of showing restraint. But little did the teens know, the quiet, elderly man they were mocking was someone who had spent decades mastering the art of karate. They were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. But for now, they saw only a defenseless old man, someone they thought would not resist. The stage was set, but the true strength of Mr. Jenkins was still hidden beneath the surface. The teasing continued, and the group of teens grew more emboldened by their laughter. Kyle, holding Mr. Jenkins' book in one hand, leaned in closer, taunting him further. "What are you gonna do, old man? You gonna fight back? You're too slow for that," he mocked, waving the book in front of Mr. Jenkins' face. The other boys snickered, not fully realizing that their actions were about to take a turn. Mr. Jenkins stayed calm, his fingers still gently gripping the sides of the bench. His eyes, though calm on the outside, were observing each one of them carefully. He could tell Kyle was trying to get a reaction out of him, pushing his limits to see how far he could go. And Mr. Jenkins, wise from his years of experience, knew that reacting in anger would only make the situation worse. Still, something inside him stirred. He remembered the discipline he had learned through years of karate training, the patience, the calmness in the face of confrontation, but also the strength to stand firm when necessary. His training had taught him not only to defend himself, but to also teach lessons about respect, something he felt was desperately needed in this situation. Finally, after what seemed like a long silence, Mr. Jenkins spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried a certain authority that stopped the teens in their tracks. "Young man, you think you can push around an old man because he's sitting peacefully. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Kyle raised an eyebrow, not expecting that response. The group fell silent for a moment, unsure whether Mr. Jenkins was serious or just bluffing. But Mr. Jenkins stood up slowly, his posture straightening as he rose from the bench. The teens took a small step back, still unsure of what to expect. With a calm expression, Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath and extended his hand to Kyle, motioning for him to return the book. "You can keep your mockery, but you should learn to respect others. That's the first lesson in life," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. Kyle looked at the hand outstretched toward him, and for a moment, he hesitated. His confidence wavered, but his pride pushed him to stand his ground. With a quick motion, Kyle tossed the book back to Mr. Jenkins. He was expecting to see Mr. Jenkins shrink back or get upset. Instead, the older man caught the book effortlessly, his hand steady. There was a quiet tension in the air, and then it happened. Mr. Jenkins shifted his weight, moved quickly, and before anyone could react, he had placed his hand on Kyle's wrist and gently but firmly twisted it. Kyle, stunned by the speed and precision of Mr. Jenkins' movement, found himself unable to move. The other boys gasped, wide-eyed, as Kyle, still holding onto his pride, found himself in a hold that left him powerless. Don't underestimate anyone based on their age, appearance, or strength, Mr. Jenkins said calmly, his voice firm, but without anger. True strength comes from within, and sometimes the strongest people are the ones you least expect. Kyle stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing as he realized what had just happened. The other teens, once confident, now looked at Mr. Jenkins with a mixture of shock and respect. Slowly, Kyle managed to break free from Mr. Jenkins' grip, rubbing his wrist and looking at the old man in disbelief. The tension slowly melted into silence. Mr. Jenkins didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked back to the bench, sitting down, his movements calm and measured, as if nothing had happened. The teens, still in shock, looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. In that moment, something had changed. They had all witnessed the quiet power of patience, wisdom, and strength, lessons they hadn't expected from an elderly man on a park bench. The group of teens, now more humbled, walked away silently, their arrogance replaced with respect. The lesson had been learned without a single harsh word or violent action. And Mr. Jenkins, he simply went back to his book, knowing that sometimes the best way to teach is through calm action, not confrontation. The teens slowly made their way out of the park, their footsteps quiet, their heads hanging low. For the first time in a long while, they were silent, each of them processing what had just happened. Kyle, the leader of the group, walked with his hands in his pockets, his usual confidence replaced by a mixture of shame and confusion. He had never expected that an elderly man would be able to outsmart him so effortlessly, much less teach him a lesson without saying a single harsh word. He had thought Mr. Jenkins was just some old guy sitting in the park, but now he saw him in an entirely new light. As they reached the edge of the park, one of the other boys, Mark, spoke up. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He moved so fast. I thought he was just some old man, but he was something else." "Yeah," Kyle replied, his voice low. "I didn't expect that. He didn't even look like he was trying." He rubbed his wrist, still feeling the grip Mr. Jenkins had placed on him. It hadn't been painful, but the precision and calmness had unsettled him. He was used to being the one in control, the one who decided how things went. But today, Mr. Jenkins had flipped the script. The group walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Kyle was thinking about how he had treated Mr. Jenkins, how rude and disrespectful he had been. He had never considered the fact that the old man might have had a past, a history that was far beyond anything they had imagined. He had assumed that because Mr. Jenkins was old, he was weak, and because of that assumption, he had mocked him, trying to prove something that didn't need proving. Back in the park, Mr. Jenkins sat quietly on the bench, his book open in his lap, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had hoped to teach the boys a lesson about respect, not through force or anger, but by showing them the power of inner strength and wisdom. He had seen their arrogance and their disregard for others, but he knew that sometimes a small action could make a bigger impact than a lecture ever could. He smiled softly to himself, knowing that they had learned more than they realized. As the teens walked back through the neighborhood, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. He was no longer the brash, loud teenager who felt he had to prove his worth by belittling others. He had learned humility, and it had come from someone he never would have expected. The encounter with Mr. Jenkins had opened his eyes to the idea that everyone, regardless of their age or appearance, had value and strength. He had underestimated the elderly man, assuming that because of his age, he was weak. But Mr. Jenkins had shown him otherwise. Through his actions and calm demeanor, he had demonstrated a strength that Kyle had never seen before. Kyle and his friends didn't say much to each other as they walked home, but something had shifted. It wasn't just about Mr. Jenkins anymore. It was about how they viewed the world. Kyle realized that he had been wrong about a lot of things, wrong about respect, wrong about how to treat others, and wrong about thinking that strength only came in physical form. He couldn't help but think about what Mr. Jenkins had said. True strength comes from within. It was a simple phrase, but it carried so much meaning. The next day, Kyle found himself back at the park, though this time he wasn't there to mock anyone. He didn't see Mr. Jenkins at first, but when he did, he felt a sense of respect he hadn't felt before. He walked over to the bench, and without saying anything, he sat down next to the elderly man. Mr. Jenkins glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "You came back," Mr. Jenkins said with a small smile. Kyle nodded, feeling a bit awkward. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for yesterday. I didn't mean to be disrespectful." Mr. Jenkins looked at him for a moment before giving a gentle nod. "Apology accepted, young man. It's all part of learning." Kyle sat in silence for a few minutes, unsure of what to say next. But somehow, the quiet company of Mr. Jenkins made him feel at ease. They didn't need words. Kyle felt like he was learning something much bigger than just courage or strength. He was learning about kindness, humility, and respect, things he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Over the next few weeks, Kyle began to think a lot about the lessons he had learned from Mr. Jenkins. At first, he felt embarrassed about how he had treated the elderly man in the park, but gradually, the feeling shifted to something more meaningful, a deep respect. It was clear to him now that strength wasn't just about physical power or being the loudest in the room. True strength came from inside, from wisdom, patience, and the ability to remain calm in difficult situations. Mr. Jenkins had shown him that without saying much. Kyle had never expected to learn such an important lesson from someone he thought was just an old man sitting on a park bench. One afternoon, Kyle found himself walking past the park again. It had become a habit for him now, not to mock or make fun of anyone, but just to enjoy the peaceful surroundings. He felt a strange pull to visit Mr. Jenkins again. The man had shown him kindness, and Kyle realized he owed him more than just an apology. He had learned something about life that he hadn't understood before, and he wanted to thank Mr. Jenkins for that. As he walked into the park, he spotted the familiar figure of Mr. Jenkins sitting on the same bench where their paths had crossed before. This time, Mr. Jenkins wasn't reading a book. He was simply watching the world go by. Kids playing on the swings, the sound of laughter in the air, and the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees. Kyle took a deep breath and walked over to the bench. "Mind if I sit?" Kyle asked hesitantly. Mr. Jenkins looked up, his eyes twinkling with recognition. "Of course, young man. It's a free country, after all." Kyle sat down beside him, feeling a little awkward at first. "I've been thinking about what happened. About what you taught me, Kyle started. And I just wanted to say thank you. You know, for not getting angry or fighting back. I've learned a lot from you. Mr. Jenkins smiled softly. I'm glad to hear that. Life has a funny way of teaching us things when we least expect it, doesn't it? Kyle nodded, looking down at his feet for a moment. He felt a little embarrassed, but also grateful. Yeah, it really does. I used to think strength was all about how tough you looked or how loud you could be. But you showed me that real strength is about patience and staying calm when everything's crazy. You don't have to prove yourself by hurting others. Mr. Jenkins chuckled quietly, his gaze still calm and steady. That's the thing, young man. Strength comes from within. The greatest warriors I know are those who fight to protect others, not to prove a point. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Kyle. Just be the person you know you can be. Kyle thought about those words. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he truly understood something. He didn't need to try to be tough to impress his friends or anyone else. The real power came from kindness, from respecting others, and from being true to yourself. That was the lesson Mr. Jenkins had shown him, even when he hadn't known he was teaching it. I want to be better, Kyle said after a pause. Not just for me, but for everyone around me. I want to treat people the way I should have treated you from the beginning. Mr. Jenkins nodded, his eyes warm with approval. That's all anyone can ask for. It's never too late to start doing the right thing. The fact that you're trying now speaks volumes about who you are. The two of them sat together in silence for a while, watching the sun begin to set. There was no need for many words. In that quiet moment, Kyle felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he was looking for. He had learned the importance of humility, respect, and kindness. It wasn't always easy, but it was always the right choice. As Kyle stood to leave, he felt like a different person than the one who had walked into the park weeks ago. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I won't forget this. Mr. Jenkins smiled at him warmly. I'm sure you'll make the world a better place, Kyle. Just remember, it's the small things that often matter the most. Kyle walked away from the park that day with a new sense of purpose, knowing that he would never look at the world, or at people, quite the same way again. After that day in the park, Kyle's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. He started to see things differently, to notice how often people were treated poorly simply because of their appearance or age. He had always been caught up in what his friends thought, trying to fit in with the group by being loud and daring. But now, after everything he had learned from Mr. Jenkins, he realized that there was more to life than trying to impress others. There was real value in kindness, respect, and treating people the way they deserved. Kyle's friends noticed the change in him. At first, they teased him, calling him soft or telling him he was acting like an old man. But as time passed, Kyle found himself standing up for the things he believed in. He started talking to people he would have ignored before, reaching out to those who seemed lonely or excluded. He stopped participating in the pranks or jokes that had once been so funny to him. It wasn't that he wanted to be a saint or preach to his friends, but he realized that the jokes weren't worth the hurt they caused. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Kyle saw Mr. Jenkins sitting on the same bench as before. This time, Mr. Jenkins was talking to a younger woman who appeared to be asking him for advice. She looked unsure, and Mr. Jenkins, as always, listened patiently before offering his thoughts. Kyle stood at a distance for a moment, watching how calm and confident Mr. Jenkins was in that interaction. There was no rush in the way he spoke. He took his time, and the young woman seemed to appreciate his wisdom. Kyle took a deep breath and walked over. "Hey, Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice a little shy but firm. Mr. Jenkins turned to him and smiled, as if he had been expecting him. "Hello, Kyle. What brings you here today?" Kyle hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside him. "I've been thinking about a lot of things, and I wanted to thank you again for what you taught me. I know I wasn't exactly the nicest kid before, but I'm trying to be better. I don't want to be the kind of person I was." Mr. Jenkins gave him a thoughtful look, nodding slowly. Change doesn't happen overnight, Kyle, but the fact that you're trying shows growth. Many people go their whole lives without realizing what you already know. You've learned something important, and that's something worth holding on to. Kyle smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't always easy to make the right choices, especially when old habits tried to pull him back into his past ways. But he knew that he was on the right path now. And the best part was, he wasn't alone. He had Mr. Jenkins to remind him that change was possible and that kindness could lead to real strength. As the days passed, Kyle's transformation became clearer to everyone around him. He began helping his classmates, listening to others with more patience, and even helping out at the community center. His old friends still teased him from time to time, but Kyle didn't mind anymore. He knew that his choices were making a difference, and that felt more important than fitting into the group. Slowly, some of his friends started to follow his lead, treating others with more respect and being more thoughtful in how they spoke. One day, after a long week of school, Kyle walked to the park again. Mr. Jenkins was sitting on the same bench, but today there was something different about the scene. A few people were gathered around him, listening intently to his words. Kyle stood by the bench, watching the older man interact with the group. He had become more than just a quiet, wise figure to Kyle. He had become a symbol of what true strength looked like, someone who never sought attention, but still commanded it with his presence, wisdom, and kindness. Kyle approached the group and sat down beside Mr. Jenkins, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," he said softly, "for everything." Mr. Jenkins looked at him with a warm smile. "You've done the hard work, Kyle. I've just been here to remind you of what you already knew inside. You're the one who made the choice to change. Keep it up." Kyle nodded, knowing that he would never forget the lessons he had learned. Life wasn't always easy, but it was always better when you approached it with kindness, respect, and a willingness to grow. And as long as he kept those lessons in mind, he knew he could face whatever came next. As the weeks passed, Kyle began to feel more at peace with the changes he was making in his life. The lessons he had learned from Mr. Jenkins stayed with him every day, guiding his actions and decisions. He was no longer the same person who had once walked into that park with arrogance and a desire to mock others. Now he was someone who valued kindness, humility, and respect. His friends, who had once teased him for his new attitude, started to notice the difference in him. Some even began to change their behavior as well, influenced by the way Kyle treated people. One afternoon, as Kyle walked through the park, he saw Mr. Jenkins sitting on the bench again, as he had countless times before. Kyle smiled to himself. It had become a sort of tradition. Every week, he would find himself walking by the park, sometimes to talk to Mr. Jenkins, sometimes just to sit and reflect on how far he had come. Today, however, there was something different about the scene. A group of younger kids was gathered around Mr. Jenkins, listening intently as he spoke to them. He wasn't just teaching them karate or telling them stories. He was sharing lessons about life, about how to treat others, and how to be strong in the face of adversity. Kyle couldn't help but pause and watch for a moment. He had never realized how much of an impact Mr. Jenkins had on the community. He wasn't just a karate master or a wise old man. He was a mentor, someone who had helped shape the lives of many people, including Kyle. As he stood there, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything Mr. Jenkins had taught him. It wasn't just about martial arts. It was about living with purpose and integrity. Mr. Jenkins noticed Kyle standing a little ways off and smiled warmly, nodding for him to come over. Kyle walked over, and the kids, who had been listening so attentively, looked up at him with curiosity. They recognized him from the times he had come to visit Mr. Jenkins before. One of the younger kids, a girl with bright eyes, looked up at him and asked, "Are you going to teach us karate too?" Kyle chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm not a karate expert like Mr. Jenkins, but I've learned a lot from him." He turned to Mr. Jenkins with a grateful smile. "He's the real teacher here." Mr. Jenkins nodded and spoke to the group of kids, his voice calm but filled with wisdom. Kyle's right. What matters most isn't how fast you can move or how strong you are. It's about your heart. Strength is found in your ability to stand up for what's right, to help others when they need it, and to show respect to everyone you meet. Kyle listened to the words carefully, realizing just how much he had absorbed from Mr. Jenkins over the past few months. He had learned about physical strength, but more importantly, he had learned about emotional strength. The strength to be kind, the strength to change, and the strength to face his fears. After a while, the group of kids dispersed, thanking Mr. Jenkins and running off to play. Kyle took a seat next to the older man on the bench. They sat in silence for a few moments, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of the park. It was a simple moment, but it felt like everything had come full circle for Kyle. He had gone from someone who didn't think about his actions to someone who now understood the importance of making a positive difference in the world. "You've done well, Kyle," Mr. Jenkins said, breaking the silence. "You've found your strength, and that's not something many people do in their lives." Kyle looked at him, feeling a warm sense of pride. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Jenkins. You showed me that true strength doesn't come from fighting or trying to prove something. It comes from being a good person, from helping others, and from standing up for what's right." Mr. Jenkins smiled, his eyes twinkling with approval. "You've learned well. Just remember, the journey never stops. Keep growing, keep learning, and keep teaching others what you've learned." As Kyle stood to leave, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the wisdom Mr. Jenkins had shared with him. He had come to the park that day just to visit, but in a way, it had become a full-circle moment for him. He had started out lost, trying to prove himself through pride and arrogance. But now, he knew that the real strength was in kindness, in learning, and in helping others grow. And with that, he walked away, feeling more confident and at peace than ever before. As the months passed, Kyle found himself visiting the park more often. What had started as a simple habit had transformed into something much deeper, a way for him to connect with the wisdom Mr. Jenkins had shared with him. Kyle had changed, and he knew it. His friends noticed too. They stopped making fun of him for being different, for not joining in on their teasing or jokes anymore. Instead, some of them even started asking him about how he had changed. Kyle didn't push his newfound values onto them, but when they asked, he shared the lessons he had learned from Mr. Jenkins. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, he noticed Mr. Jenkins sitting on his usual bench, a small group of kids gathered around him. They were listening intently, just like the first time Kyle had witnessed Mr. Jenkins teach. This time, however, Kyle approached with a different purpose. He wasn't just here to observe. He was here to give back, to take the wisdom Mr. Jenkins had shown him and pass it on. "Hey, Mr. Jenkins," Kyle greeted as he approached the group. The kids looked up, some recognizing him from his past visits. Mr. Jenkins gave him a welcoming smile, and the group fell silent, allowing Kyle to speak. "I've learned a lot from Mr. Jenkins," Kyle said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "And I think it's time I share a little bit of that with all of you." The kids were quiet, intrigued by Kyle's sudden shift in demeanor. He wasn't the same guy who had once been too proud to listen. He was someone new, someone who had learned that kindness and respect were far more important than trying to prove something to others. "I've been where some of you are," Kyle continued. "I used to think the best way to get respect was by being loud and tough, by making people laugh at others. But I learned something much more important. Real respect comes from how you treat people. It's not about what you can take or show off. It's about what you can give, how you can help others." The kids listened closely, some nodding, others looking thoughtful. Mr. Jenkins sat quietly, a proud smile on his face, watching Kyle take on the role of the teacher. It was a moment that felt full of meaning. Kyle, once a boy full of pride and arrogance, was now sharing the lessons that had changed his life. He was helping the next generation understand the same things Mr. Jenkins had helped him understand. As Kyle spoke, he shared stories of his past mistakes, of how he used to look down on people just to make himself feel bigger. But he also shared how he had learned to listen, to be patient, and to respect everyone, regardless of their age or background. If you show kindness to people, you'll be amazed at how much stronger you'll feel, Kyle said, his voice filled with sincerity. And the best part, you'll make the world a little better just by being kind. After he finished speaking, there was a brief silence before one of the kids raised their hand. "How do we start?" the young boy asked, his voice full of curiosity. Kyle smiled, feeling the weight of the question. "It starts small," he said. "Maybe it's helping someone you see sitting alone, or sticking up for someone when others are being rude. It doesn't have to be big. Just start with one thing, and you'll see how it changes you and the people around you." Mr. Jenkins, who had been quietly watching, finally spoke. "Kyle's right. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with you, and the world becomes a better place one step at a time." As the kids began to leave, thanking Mr. Jenkins and Kyle for the lessons, Kyle felt a sense of pride in his heart. This was what Mr. Jenkins had taught him, passing on knowledge and wisdom to others. And now he was doing the same thing. He wasn't just changing his own life anymore. He was helping others change as well. As Kyle walked home that day, he realized just how far he had come. He had started as a boy who was quick to judge and quick to act out of pride, but now he was someone who could stand tall with kindness, humility, and the strength to help others. He was grateful for the lessons Mr. Jenkins had given him, and he knew that no matter where life took him, he would continue to pass those lessons on, just as Mr. Jenkins had done for him.